Welcome back to the next part, and what we're gonna begin with where we have left off, because we already created a graph for the graph structure here. We're gonna do the same thing, but this time for trees as well as rocks. So to begin with, let's actually create a new static mesh spawner here. As duplicate as well, so we can have it for rocks. So in this case, what I'm going to do is to select the static mesh spawner here, and I'm going to add 3 entries for 3 different trees. Let me open this up, each one of them. First, I'm going to start with the first one. And this one, I'm going to use SM_European Beach. And the one I'm actually looking for, you can take any trees you want, but because for this part of exercise, I'm going to use this one, forest_05pp. I'm going to close this and let's open this as well as add here. I'm going to use 08. And the last but not least is the third one. And I'm actually going to use the forest02. Just so that it's kind of randomized. It's entirely up to how you want it, but for this, I'm just going to use that. And also for the transfer points, let's just do a little bit mix of it. So here I'm going to set to like -20, minimum, and maximum 20. And let's do the same for Y values. And for that, as always, I'm going to, actually for this, I'm just going to use -180. And let's say 180 here on a Z axis. And also let's just play a bit with scaling so we can randomize scale. I set to 0.6 and here maybe 1.2. It may be a bit too big, but let's see how it goes. Awesome. So save it and test out what it looks on the screen. Oop, the weight's too much. And that's quite obvious because we still have to set up our, in this case, sample spacing. So just like we did before on the grass, we can just go back and set this to something. In this case, we are going to make a bigger distancing in between the trees that are going spawn. So I'm going to set something to maybe 400. And the same goes for the border sample spacing. So let's go and check this out. So now you start seeing trees start to appear. And it looks very cool because now you're getting to that rhythm of the sort of realistic look to it. So let me just make it a little bit bigger here. But because I want to also keep up in the performance level, so I'm going to decrease the number. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to set this to maybe something like a double. So let's say 800 as well in the border sample spacing. So compile it and now we're getting a bit more natural. Let's do the same thing for the rocks. So let me just copy it. So let me just connect it. Add one more entry because I think for this we're going to just use one. So let me open this up and there you should have it S_Mossy rock. And I have 3 of them. For now, I'm going to use one. So I'm going to just go click on this one. I'm going to compile it. And also let's just change this to something like 400 as well on the sample spacing. And now as you start seeing something's going wrong. And it's kind of obvious because the rocks start to appear in the rows as well as the sort of column directions. But because we can still refine our, in this case, what we call transfer points. So I'm going to go back and I set the transfer point so at least it looks a bit different. And I get to my stand there, and then here. And let's just change a bit of rotation. So I'm going to set to something like -180. The same goes for 180 here. And randomize also scale to 0.5 to 1. Compile it. And you start getting a bit of a different formation. But as you may notice, it sort of overlaps with other meshes, in this case trees. And there's a little fix for that, but also that includes kind of a structure of nodes that requires to reduce, but also remove any overlapping, in this case, rocks with the trees. And to do this, we need to introduce a node called indifference node. So let me just go back to this, what we have graph here. Let me move this out of the way. In this case, what I'm going to do is to right click and search for difference node. And I'm going to connect this together, but because before I can do a difference node, but I also want to make sure that I want to also remove any overlapping points, which comes from, in this case, projection and including spline sampler and other nodes connected with that. So I'm going to right click and search for self-pruning, and I'm going to then connect it all together to the source. And we are going then connect spline sampler to the self-pruning, and you can actually remove this one. So you can just hold Alt left button and then press on the left mouse button at the same time and just removes this. And then I'm going to connect it. So that should be enough. And I will do as well, because I want to make sure that when it overlaps with the trees that already are being generated on the top of here. So I'm going to actually first press C to comment this. I call it trees. And also I'm going to make sure that the difference nodes is making with the, in this case, rocks, it makes with the trees. So I'm going to then, from our transform here, I'm going to also add to the difference here. And if I go and then save and execute it, so now you start seeing the grass, in this case rocks, kind of moved away. Some of them being removed, and they're only appearing at the edges of this entire actor blueprint here in the forest. And you can also do this by increasing the number of this generating, in this case, sample spacing. So I'm gonna maybe reduce to something like 200. And now you start seeing the rocks appearing, but also you can do extra further modification to make the, in this case, rocks appearing a bit more natural. So in this case, I'm also going to do is introduce another node, and I call it bounce modifier. The bounce modifier, what it does here, it pushes some of the points, so it creates bounce between the points that's going to be generated, and you can basically tweak them with the numbers of transformation numbers here to move the points away from generated position of the points with the points that are already existing, if that kind of makes sense. So in this case, I'm going to do is I'm going to move it here, and I'm going to put it right in between the trees, because that's where we're going to do with the trees for that. And I'm going to actually disconnect this difference, and I'm going to connect it into these differences here. And I'm going to disconnect the static mesh spawner, and then I'm going to then directly connect the bounce modifier to static mesh here. And then because I also wanted to modify my density function, I set to binary. And I think we'll be okay for now to test this out, so let's see what happens. And we can maybe try and see if we can change the number here on the bounce modifier and maybe set this to perhaps translate. So let's just put this aside and start observing what happens when you start dealing with some of the numbers here. So if I can instead take on bounce modifier, set the steepness, and let's observe what's happening on the level. So then I can set this minimum to something like minus 10, 20, 20. And the same goes for minus 20 here and 20. And what if we go intersect? And as you can see, the modifications based on what model you're working with can deliberately make those changes and apply into the, in this case, inside the interior that works within the actor. And then you can set this to whatever you want to. You can then scale it, you can translate it. And depending on what model you want to come with this, I usually set this to intersect. And then you can then apply these changes by modifying those numbers here. You can just set 0. And then translate it, scale it. And let's say we leave it at minus 20. Let's say we get scale. And maybe we can do is also select our spline sampler here. And we can change our interior sample spacing to be a little bit bigger. That makes it a bit more natural. Cool, awesome. And maybe we can also increase our transfer point scale. So set to something the minimum, like 0.2 to 1.2. So now I start seeing that some of the rocks started to appear in different formation. And also remember that it's not perfect, so you can always start. If you're not happy with some results, you can still play with the settings here and do a little more extra modifications, not only just on the, in this case, bounce modifier, but also you can do is to set up some of these self-pruning nodes here too. So you can then set this to whatever you changes you want to be on the type for the pruning, and you can set these to whatever values you want to work with. So that's why it's very good to kind of give yourself a time and figure out what's the best setting at least works for you by using, let's say, bounce modifier as well as self-pruning, because those are the ones that affects the not just the source but also the difference based on the information you want for the points to be appearing when it comes to spawning some of the static meshes here. So this is pretty much what we have so far done. And I think this is a first evaluation to, in this case, PCG graph that we're working with. Now I can just go and select all of these and then comment this and call it the rock. And let me just change this color. And this is your first PCG graph. So now what you can actually do is you can actually test this out on any different landscape formation. So for example, if I can go and select my PCG graph and I move this all the way where you see the rocks are, then now you start seeing that cliffs, the mountains that are literally forming dirt on my landscape affects well with the PCG graph. So that PCG graph reacts and projects properly on the landscape's formation here. But as you may notice, the trees and as well as the rocks and other parts of the static meshes are not spawning properly, and its angle stays just like perpendicular to the surface of the, in this case, landscape data here. So there's a little bit of fix for that, because naturally this shouldn't be happening. So in order for the trees to be growing upwards, there's a fix, and in this case, fix helps to not only make the trees appear upward, but at the same time, it can work for every other static meshes that you want to deal with within the PCG graph. Just to show you how to fix this, go back to your PCG graph and also go and when we are on the trees category, make sure your absolute rotation is set to true. So if I go and select this and see what happens when we apply to that. So if you set up and then you start seeing your, in this case, trees started to appear naturally upwards. So that's a very cool fix. So every time I want to move this around, so let's say I move it here and there, that means the trees will always stay the same by appearing upwards in this case. So that's why it's a very handy tool to work with. So this was your first introduction to PCG graph. And in the next lesson, what we're actually going to do is to go to Actor Blueprint and add some of the variables that will enhance the not only quality, but also customize the functionality of the tool that we just created for that. So when we dealing with, in this case, Actor Blueprint, we can also have some of the variables that we can basically interact with the PCG graph directly. Instead of going to PCG graph editor, we can just have it literally outline here, outsurface into our default panel, which then will have these parameters to tweak the numbers as well as the spacing in between each static mesh, and also help you to sort of be able to not only modify, be also be more interactive with the tool itself. And I'll show you how to do this in the next part of the lesson. But for now, let's leave it as it is. Thank you so much and see you in the next part.